shall see what we shall see, right?
Yes, well, what you shall see is this book.
Ah,
This is it just came out 3 weeks ago,
oh my.
and it's called The Secret War Council. And so it's a part of 3 books that I've written last year. And the first one is about 1914, the second one is 1915, the sabotage campaign, and the third one is about the Mexican role in the First World War, that kind of what I talked about yesterday.
Right. Wow.
Same thing. You have this.
No, I don't have that book. I
We'll
have
get you that
in
book.
plain sight, which I don't see in plain sight here.
It should be here.
It's probably over
It's
there.
up there. Yeah. So maybe to get started, I would just read a small passage from the introduction of the book. This is based on an archival research I did. I found the papers of the German embassy in Washington that were lost, and one of the funny things that happened in World War I is that the German spy chief that was in New York lost his briefcase.
Oh.
And in the briefcase were all kinds of documents that were very compromising, including his checkbook where he wrote checks to German spies and so forth. And his name was Heinrich Albert. And he was the minister without portfolio. They made fun of him. So this is what happened. It was on a hot New York afternoon of July 24th, 1915, that Heinrich F. Albert and George Sylvester Viereck, he was a poet, German-American, and he worked in the propaganda department. They rode the 6th Avenue elevated train from the lower Manhattan offices to Uptown. 2 U.S. Secret Service agents, Frank Burke and W.H. Houghton, shadowed the pair. Viereck got off the train at the 23rd Street station. Houghton followed the propagandist, so Viereck. Burke stayed on and watched Albert on the way home to his apartment at 105 East 51st Street. And this is a quote, this is the report from Mr. Burke. A young woman boarded the car and took the vacant seat beside Dr. Albert and began reading a book. To reach, pardon?
No.
To reach his home, Albert had to take another car at 59th Street, but when the train reached that point, he was reading, and he was not aware that the train had halted until it was about to proceed again. The stuffed briefcase was between Dr. Albert and the side of the car. When it occurred to him that he must get off, he jumped up and told the guard to wait a minute. As he got to the platform, the young woman called that he had forgotten his briefcase. Burke told the girl that the case was his, grabbed it up and headed for the station platform by another exit from the car. Dr. Albert, meanwhile, was struggling to get back into the car, his passage impeded by a fat woman in the doorway. By this time, Burke had reached the platform, looked back, and saw that Dr. Albert was visibly agitated. Other passengers on the platform provided Burke with some concealment, but the stairway leading to the street was beyond the excited German. Sparring for time, Burke partially concealed the briefcase under his coat and, leaning against the platform wall, acted as he was having trouble lighting a cigar. Dr. Albert glanced hastily about the platform, then dashed downstairs to the street below. Burke followed him. Dr. Albert was in an increasingly disturbed frame of mind. He walked out into the street, the better to scan the line of pedestrians. As an open trolley car clanged past, Burke ran out and leaped on its running board. But Dr. Albert had seen him and began pursuit. Burke told the trolley conductor that the man pursuing him was deranged, so the car did not stop for him. The briefcase incident uncovered the existence of an obscure secret organization called the War Council. Agent Frank Burke and his colleague had in fact snatched the satchel of its chief, Heinrich F. Albert. So this is kind of how the story starts. The briefcase uncovers that there is a vast German Secret Service organization in New York, and the task that these guys had was to conduct clandestine operations against the Allies, against the Entente powers on US soil. And this was, of course, right from the beginning of the war. Heinrich Albert, the chief, was a administrator, really a low-level administrator in the German government, but I think that he must have had Secret Service experience because they wouldn't have given him such a big job. And with him was Dr. Bernhard Dernburg. He was the first Jewish member of the Wilhelmine government, so he was the colonial secretary. We talked briefly about him yesterday. So he was in charge of propaganda. And then there were two other people, one of which you might know very well, Franz von Papen. Yeah, Franz von Papen was the military attaché, so he was in charge of sabotage activities and also of intelligence gathering. And the other one that was working there was Karl Boyet. He was a commander, naval commander. He was a naval attaché, and he was in charge of naval intelligence. And Felix Sommerfeld worked for him during the war. So what were these guys doing in New York? When the war broke out, one of the first things the British did is they established their blockade. So German commercial marine ships had to dock in neutral harbors. 54 ships from Hapag and Lloyd docked in New York, in Philadelphia, and Baltimore, with thousands of German sailors, many of them reservists. So this is almost an army of military people that is stranded here in the United States. Most people don't realize, where did the Germans get all these agents from? They were here. They got them right in the beginning of the war. The second thing that the English did is they cut the transatlantic cables. You have to imagine that London at the time was the financial center of the world. Any trade, any money transfers, anything that happened on international trade went through London. And so they immediately cut all the transatlantic cables that went directly to Germany and controlled all the information that was coming through London, effectively cutting the German Empire off all international trade with a snip of the wire. Very intelligent. It also cut the German embassy in the United States off all news from Germany. They couldn't get any more news. All the news was filtered through censors in London. You wonder why the British were so successful with propaganda in this time. The Germans had no chance. All the news that came from Europe were filtered by English censors. And so in end of August, Dr. Albert and Dernburg came to New York, landed in New York, and they established this new Secret Service office. And they had some very important jobs. The first job was to somehow supply the Navy, the remaining German Navy, that was still marauding in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Because of the blockade, British blockade, they could not go back to Germany. Right? So you had Admiral Spey. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was in the Far East. He had a bunch of ships, and there were several ships in the Atlantic Ocean that they were equipped as raiders. Some of them were civilian ships, Hapag ships that they outfitted with cannon and machine guns, and they were stopping commercial traffic. And so Boyet was in charge of supplying the remnants of that fleet, and Albert was the financial man. He had to make the money available for that. This was quite an undertaking. It took thousands of small ships that they had to lease in American harbors, bribe captains, falsify manifests, because you were not allowed to supply a military fleet. So where does all this coal go to? Right? You have to make up stories. It's going to Philadelphia. It's not. In fact, it was just going out to sea, and they were docking with another boat and transferring coal. Hapag, the big commercial marine office in New York, helped Boyet with that, and in the end they were discovered. Of course, it didn't take very long, but they, the good news is they had accomplished their task, because the German fleet was destroyed quite rapidly. Spee, the last battle he fought was in November in the Falkland Islands. which basically sank the rest of the German Navy. So what was left of the German Navy was in Germany, and they were docked, they couldn't leave. So that was the first big job they had, and it made the papers, and there were lawsuits filed against Hapag officers that were helping with this. And of course the American government immediately knew that Boyette was a clandestine officer. The second job they had to do was to somehow bring officers, reservists, back to Germany. Again, because of the blockade, Germans couldn't travel back to Germany. So even though everybody was called up, Germans that were in the United States or Mexico or South America could not travel back to Germany. And so Franz von Papen set up an office in New York where they sent out a message through the consulates to all the German Americans to make their passports available. Anybody that has Swiss or German or has a relative, Austrian, whatever it may be, well, Austrian wouldn't work, but Swiss or American passports, lots of German Americans had American passports, make these available, and then they had a falsifying operation. They would actually make a new picture and they cut the picture in. At that time, passports were not very sophisticated, and so they were falsifying these passports. And again, it was a tremendous operation. Nobody realized it, but hundreds and hundreds of German officers came back to Germany through these falsified passports.
Why weren't Austrian passports good for that?
Because they were part of the war. They were combatants. So they would have been stopped by the English. I mean, the whole purpose is when you get stopped in Falmouth by the British search party, you presented your passport, and it better be a neutral passport or an American passport. Otherwise, they'd lock you up. You're a combatant. The operation also didn't work very long. The guy that ran it was basically discovered quite quickly. They did some passports where they were not very well done, so the American State Department found out about it, and so this guy fled, and his successor was not very smart. He was very proud of how he was working with these falsified passports, and showed an American Secret Service agent how he was doing it, because he thought he was a customer. He was not a customer, he was actually a Secret Service agent. So they took him, and so he spent the rest of the war in prison. And the original guy, he fled to Germany, but had a bad passport. I think he had a Mexican passport, actually, and but was questioned by the British. The British took him off the ship and took him into Falmouth. And on the way to Falmouth, a German submarine torpedoed the British ship, and this guy died. So obviously, friendly fire accident, things happen. So he didn't make it. So that was the falsified passport thing. Again, another thing that made it into the news, and the Americans were quite upset about how the Germans were not obeying American laws, how they could do such a thing. The third big task that they had was they wanted to source materials in the United States and somehow smuggle them into Germany, contraband. And the British made that very difficult, but if you look at the blockade, the British blockade, it wasn't a real blockade in a legal sense. They blocked off the entire North Sea, which means Scandinavia was completely cut off, just like Germany. And so these countries complained, the United States actually complained about that. And so the British were allowing cargo to go through checks into Scandinavia. And so Heinrich Albert was very adept in declaring freight that was going to Norway or going to Denmark or going to Belgium or whatever. And the British had to let it through. Some of it they didn't. Sometimes they would also they had an operation where they would declare cargo to go to Norway, and then a German raider would come out of Kiel, and as the ship was going up north, they would raid it and take it as a prize into harbor. But it was Albert's load, so that was all planned, all pre-planned. Most of these ships were leased from private companies. Of course, the insurance companies didn't like that very much, because the ships basically disappeared every time they shipped something with Albert. So this contraband thing that was quite interesting. They also were smuggling oil. Germany doesn't have much oil, so one of the big things they needed was oil and tar. And they found a chemist, a German chemist, Dr. Scheele, who was in New Jersey, and in his laboratory he found a way to basically take oil and cook it with a chemical that would harden it, and then they would shred it and bag it and basically declare it as fertilizer.
Yeah.
And then in Germany, they could add another chemical and it would liquefy it again. And it was a brilliant thing. They did that with rubber and they did that with oil. And it actually took a long time until the British figured out what this actually was. And bags of fertilizer, none of it was fertilizer. He also engaged in a little bit of funny stuff in sabotage. He invented these little kernels of, they looked like corn, just little kernels. And they would pay agents in the Midwest to mix them into wheat or mix them into corn. And they would be bagged and then go to England, and then they would go through a mill, and then of course you wouldn't see which kernel is which anyway. And as soon as you added water, so as soon as this flour came to the bakers, as soon as you added water, it would turn the whole thing blue. It's really true. And so they had to throw away all this bread, right? But they couldn't figure out what they were doing because it already started literally in the Midwest. They were adding just a few kernels per bag into this thing. It would ruin, all the bread that was baked from it. So Dr. Scheele was quite an inventor. Later in the war, he also invented the fire bombs that were quite famous. They sank bunches of ships. Little cigar bombs that had two different chemicals separated by a paraffin divider that would corrode. If you pulled a plug, then it would corrode, and you could time it for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. So they would smuggle that into flammable loads, and then the ship would be on the high seas, and suddenly it would be fire everywhere. So Dr. Scheele was basically the German bomb maker that they had. He was in New Jersey. In the end of the war, he was discovered. Actually, he fled to Cuba, and an American Secret Service party went to Cuba and retrieved him. And he was afraid to be executed, so he switched sides and showed the Americans everything he had done. And lived happily ever after, by the way, in his community in New Jersey. I found articles in the 20s. He was like an expert witness in court cases and so forth. So he survived the war quite well. So that was the contraband thing. And then came some other more complicated tasks. The most important one was how to prevent the armada of Canadian troops to go to Europe. It's very much underestimated how many people actually were raised in Canada that had to go to Europe to fight the war. It was a huge armada. And the collection point was the Valcartier camp at the St. Lawrence River. And so the Germans mounted two separate operations that were working towards the same goal, which was to prevent the Canadians to go to Europe. The first operation was to blow up the dam between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. That dam, they hired a German agent. His name was Franz Wachendorf, although he called himself Horst von der Goltz, and wrote a book and marketed it after the war, so everybody thinks he's Horst von der Goltz. His real name is Franz Wachendorf. And the funny story about this is he used to work for Sommerfeld. He was actually one of Sommerfeld's agents, so he brought him to Papen. So Goltz was sent with a few other guys to the Welland Canal with suitcases of dynamite supplied by Franz von Papen, and they were supposed to blow up the Welland Canal, which basically would interrupt all troop movements from the western part of Canada to Valcartier. And then they sent another group of agents to Valcartier itself. And what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to sink barges in the middle of the St. Lawrence River to block the river. Actually a pretty good plan. They got pretty far with this. They actually scouted out the whole area. They rented a place there. They hired a captain. They were about to buy some of these barges. But the problem was the Welland Canal explosion never happened. And so that was supposed to be first. Wachendorf got cold feet. The Welland Canal was actually quite well guarded because it had been blown up before, several times. There were several attempts before. And so Wachendorf basically just went home. This thing never blew up. So these guys in Canada didn't go ahead with sinking these barges. So the Canadians went to Germany, or went to the Western Front, and fought. You know, they were a big part of the front there. Wachendorf actually, when he came back, was scolded, of course. Franz von Papen was furious. He gave him a passport, said, "Get the hell out of here." And Wachendorf supposedly went to Germany. In his book he writes he went to Germany. He was actually captured by the British. The British turned him and brought him back to America in 1916 to testify against Franz von Papen. So he became an English spy, and he never admitted to that. But if you look at exactly what he did, they did that with two of the agents. They were clearly turned, and then became a big propaganda thing for the British here in the United States. Because of the papers that I found, the Albert papers, it's the first time. There's lots of things written about the Welland Canal project, and there's some things written about trying to prevent the troops from leaving the St. Lawrence River, but nobody ever made the connection before that was actually the same thing. They were actually trying to do one thing with this. So that's something that's very new in my book. The next thing that the task that they had was, of course, propaganda. And like I said in the beginning, it's very hard to do propaganda if you don't even get news from the homeland. The first thing that happened is when the First World War started, Count von Bernstorff, the German ambassador, who nominally would be in charge of propaganda, of course, he was in Germany, he wasn't even here. His second in command didn't know anything about propaganda whatsoever. His name was Prince Hatzfeld von Trachenberg. He was a German prince, so so the first thing he did is he got the German embassy hired a bunch of German, American, and German professors. Hugo Münsterberg, I don't know if you know of him, a famous psychologist. There were several historians. Von Jagemann was one of them. And so they hired these German and German-American intellectuals to write articles in the New York Times and so forth about German Kultur. So the idea of starting propaganda was to teach the Americans why Germany is so superior, and because of their superiority, they must win the war. There's just no way around it. And there are millenniums to prove how superior they are. It was a catastrophic campaign. I mean, you can only imagine. You can only imagine how people reacted to these publications. So when Bernstorff, who was married to an American, so he was quite Anglophile, he'd been ambassador to the United States since 1908, very well liked here in the United States, had 4 honorable doctor's degrees, also from Princeton University. And so when he came to the United States, he was horrified at what was happening with propaganda. So he took over, and he and Dr. Dernberg together, they were trying to figure out, what do we do? Well, the first thing we should do is we should get all the German Americans and all the Czechs and all the Austrians and Hungarians and all the pro-German minorities in the United States. They all had their own newspapers. They only had their own publications, as well as Jewish publications. And so they were going to all these editors and bribed them, basically gave them some money, said, why don't you write something nice about Germany, And so that's the first thing they did, which was actually quite successful. It shored up the people that were probably pro-German anyway in the first place. But then Bernstorff basically realized, we need an American newspaper. We can't handle this. We need a major American newspaper. And so he asked the German government, can I do this? They said, well, how much will it cost? So he asked around, the Washington Post was for sale. So for a lousy $200,000, he could have bought the Washington Post, but the German government said, too expensive. We're not paying for this. It's really true. It's really true.
I think
That would have been a great investment.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? It was very, very close. And I wanted to read you. Something here. The propaganda was just lagging, and none other than Felix Sommerfeld, who else could it be? He goes to Dr. Dernburg and says, look, this is all wrong what you're doing. I have an idea. And so this is the report that I read from Sommerfeld. I came into the Astor one night, the Hotel Astor, a big hotel in Times Square in New York. There was a dinner party in one of the large dining rooms. There were lots of men in there in full dress. And I was standing at the desk and somebody said to me, how do you do? And I don't know who it was, some German from Mexico, probably Mr. Stallforth or so. And turned around, and he was standing with a man with a black beard and said, Your Excellency, I want you to meet Mr. Sommerfeld. I heard a good deal about you, Dernburg said to Sommerfeld. I said, I'm glad you have. He said, I would like to talk with you, he said. I'm busy, but I will telephone you soon. We finally agreed on 2 or 3 days later, 11 in the morning. I went to Broadway, which is his office on 1123 Broadway, and he said to me the following, Mr. Sommerfeld, I have heard that you know better than anybody here in this country the sentiment and the feeling of the administration in Washington and the feeling of the country, because you come in contact with lots of prominent Americans in political life, which was really true. He was friends with General Scott, who was the chief of staff, military chief of staff of President Wilson. He knew Lindley Garrison, the Secretary of War. He was friends with Lindley Garrison. They would have tea together when he came back from El Paso, came through town. So he had contacts into the highest echelons of the American government. I said, yes, sir, I know it pretty well. He said, will you give me a fair statement and opinion about everything? I said, yes, sir. I said, first of all, Your Excellency, you must remember from now on that the time is past when deals are made under the table. The bribing, he knew about the bribing. You know? You must put your cards on the table in Washington. You must write every letter to the government. I was referring to the German government. Letters and telegrams in such a way that tomorrow morning they could be published. It's very smart. He knew, the cables were cut, so everything went through, so he didn't want any scandals. Yeah? He said, do you mean to tell me you're going to publish diplomatic correspondence? I said, there's no such thing as secret diplomatic correspondence. And I told him how I had dealt all those years with Washington, how I would go to see Mr. Garrison, and told him simply, Mr. Secretary, I'm placing the matter on the table. I have the cards on the table. I will tell you what I can do and mean to do. And he would believe it. I said, the other night I was standing in the hotel lobby and saw a newspaperman and said, who's that man? And he said, he's the German publicity agent, a man named Klaus. His actual name was Clausen. He used to be advertisement agent for the Hamburg America line, and I told him, Your Excellency, the best way to do that was not to have any German, but to have an American newspaperman and give him all the telegrams about the war and let him publish them. And I said, they know what to publish. Don't tell him what to do and what not to do. They have the hand on the pulse of this nation every moment, and they know what to do. It's very smart advice. So he was basically telling Dernburg, forget about all these Germans, these professors, whatever it may be. You need an American newspaperman. And this American newspaperman turned out to be William Bayard Hale. And if you remember the Decena Tragica, Hale was the one that Wilson sent to find out what happened at the Decena Tragica. And so he was a friend of Wilson's. He had written a biography of Wilson, helped him in the 1912 elections. And so he was basically out of a job, and Sommerfeld said, you know what, we can bring Hale on. And they did. And so here were Sommerfeld's rules on how to do good propaganda. Rule number 1, limit access to information and control the message for each targeted channel. Sommerfeld practiced this meticulously, much to the chagrin of journalists who sought access to Madero or Villa. That's true, he was the gatekeeper. Rule number 2, preempt an attack. Line up the important players beforehand and win the argument. This is the essence of his message to General Scott on January 6. There are numerous examples in Sommerfeld's communications with Hopkins, Secretaries Bryan and Garrison, all preempt him an attack from the